For this edition of Building Safety Faces, I'm joined by Robin Hawkes. So Robin Hawkes is not only impacted by the building safety crisis himself as a leaseholder, but also has 35 years plus of working in the social housing sector across London. So I think brings a really unique insight into the whole mess and situation that we're in at the moment. So the idea is to have a chat, bring this person from Twitter to life for everybody, and get to know Robin a bit better and his situation and what he understands is going on in the market at the moment. So Robin, welcome.
Okay. Yes, thank you very much. Opportunity to contribute to this and hopefully maintain the momentum that's been built up, particularly through Twitter, on the ever deepening cladding scandal.
Fantastic, thank you. And we were talking just a second ago before we hit the record button about the your use of Twitter and how you've seen this build through as the building safety crisis or cladding scandal, whatever we want to call it, has grown. So, talk us through your observations in terms of how this has happened in relation to other campaigns or issues that you've seen before as you've been using the platform.
Well, I think it's been very striking that the way in which so many people have seen the opportunity to get across the appalling situation that they are in individually and as groups through the use of Twitter, as I say, as individuals and as groups. And I've been on Twitter now since, I think, 2012, and I've been involved in a number of major housing issues over that period of time. I've got a long commitment to the building of social rent. We don't see very much of that happening for all sorts of reasons over recent years, but also other campaigns. And I've had a long involvement with two estates in Hammersmith and Fulham, the West Kensington Gibbs Green estates, where the community had to wage a campaign for 10 years to try and stop the demolition of their homes. And I think another aspect that really worries me about this, and it's been touched on by others through Twitter, is that it is a massive problem. And what's been interesting, where the EWS one surveys, the intrusive surveys have been carried out, is, as of course we know, it's not just a cladding issue, but there's a whole host of other building safety. So I think that what's become clear in those limited number of cases where the EWS1 survey has been done is that this is far more than just a cladding issue. And it often gets called, it gets paraphrased as the cladding scandal. We do that all the time. But what we know, and is evidenced by the surveys, is that there's a whole range of other building safety issues to do with the construction of buildings, particularly over the last 20 years. And there doesn't seem to be the preparedness to address that problem fully and properly. And the amendments that are being proposed currently to the EWS1, which would take potentially quite a few blocks out of the requirement for the survey, it's as though, oh, well, then they don't have the problem anymore. The problem that's been revealed by these surveys, which can be to do with fire breaks within the cavity, compartmentalization of buildings, a whole host of problems that reflect very, very badly on the construction industry, as Greenhalgh has acknowledged, and yet are not being addressed. And I think, to my mind, the way forward with this, as many others have said, is that it's within the government's power to address this properly and to acknowledge that it has a significant responsibility here because of
So Robin, this is the point, if I can cut in. So I think this cuts to the heart of what we're talking about, that at the moment, if we say conservative estimates, this is a £15 billion problem to put right. I think
conservatively, that is,
conservative with a very large C, I would say. at the moment, if we take the 1.6 billion broadly, let's say at the moment the government taxpayer have provided 10% of the funding solution, and we say that we need to go after developers, is it credible that the government's part of this problem is only 10%? Now, my gut feel is, I haven't put a percentage on it, but it's a significant part of the problem is the overall governance, the deregulation over decades that has led us to this point. So can we move forward with developer funding or freeholder levies or whatever we're going to call them without a greater degree of contrition on behalf of the government to say, we need to meet you somewhere in the middle? We're, for example, providing on the taxpayer's behalf half of the money, we're looking to the industry for the other half. But if you're looking to the industry for 90%, is that fair from an industry perspective? And do you think, we don't seem to have had that discussion or debate? Certainly not.
No, I think that's right. And I think that's because the government ministers have not wanted to have it. I mean, while acknowledging there's been a real issue with regulation going back over many, many years, I mean, it is clear that it was one of the tenets of the incoming coalition government in 2002. I mean, I think there is a clear case to be answered here that, that given that the incoming government in 2010, the coalition government had a very strong view that it wanted to reduce the amount of red tape, as they saw it, regulation in our eyes, and to make it easier for constructors, developers, makers of components to be able to get on and build things. And I think we're seeing a lot of the consequences of that gradually coming through now, particularly because of the EWS1 surveys. And, not touched on it yet, the appalling information that's come out of the Grenfell inquiry. I think we're all sort of jaw dropped at the scale of how much has been wrong with the construction industry, supervision and the consequences of easing up regulation. So to answer the original question, yes, I think absolutely the government bears a big responsibility of this because of the consequences of the easing up of regulation or the vagueness around it that enables companies like Kingspan to get away with what they did. An extraordinary state of affairs, as we've seen just in this last week, that Kingspan insulation is sitting there waiting to be put back into buildings having the remediation work. I mean, how on earth can that be a satisfactory outcome of this, what's intended to be different approach to building safety and fire control? So yes, and I think that to many of us, the logical approach here would have been for the government to recognise their responsibility for this, to provide substantially greater upfront funding to enable works to get underway. I mean, here we are years after Grenfell and still an extraordinary number of blocks have not had remediation. To put that money up front because they're the only people in a position to do this, and then look at the means of clawing back from the responsible parties, which of course excludes leaseholders.
So from a technical front, I mean, yes, I've been an advocate all the way along that we need more money. You know, that more money is required, but even spending that money will take time, and there's a process that needs to go through. And in that intervening period, unless you issue prohibition notices for all of these buildings and move people into hotels, people are living and families are living in these homes that are deemed to be unsafe. But I think if I ask, well, I ask all residents, you know, how unsafe is your building? The answer is nobody knows, because we've never actually objectively measured or benchmarked these buildings against each other to say, on the 0 to 100 danger scale, what score does my building get and for what reason? So I think there's this sort of strict liability. You've got a dangerous building, it needs to be ripped to pieces and you need to spend millions of pounds to do it and it's going to land with you argument that how far over that threshold am I between being a building that can be left alone, so in EWS1 terms, a B1, versus a B2. So how B2 am I? And that process is entirely subjective. There was a question I was going to ask you, or an observation about EWS1 as we were talking about it, that depending on who you talk to, you'll hear that EWS1 is not a safety assessment, it's a lending tool, it's a valuation tool. That's the RICS line. But then similarly, the EWS1, which I have in front of me right here, because I have one on my desk at all times, is specifically asking, and if you get a B2 rating, I have concluded that an adequate standard of safety is not achieved. How can that be anything other than an assessment of safety?
No, well, I mean, clearly, when you look at when it was introduced and how it was meant to apply, I mean, the government have said on many occasions, look, it shouldn't be used in all these circumstances. And yet in practice, when you're looking at an industry which is all about trying to minimize risk, it's the assessment of risk in terms of mortgage lending, and from the point of view of insurers, what else are they going to do? And when it comes to the proposed amendments, as we saw last time when they said that various buildings would be exempted from the need from EWS1, there wasn't buy-in. And I think there's still a big question, even if the latest amendments as proposed are put into the new RICS form, what will be the view of those giving mortgages, those that are insuring, when they've already seen that where the surveys have been done, there are very, very serious problems that need rectification. And many of those are not addressed in any case in the government's limited funding that they've made available. As people have said, on balconies, all sorts of other things are not there as part of what can be tackled. We also have this outrageous position that people are on an interim basis having to meet enormous costs for waking watch. I mean, we had what appeared to be a bizarre situation where Jenny referred to how it should be regulated, or it should be referred to. There is no regulator for it, totally unregulated, and yet it's costing people initially. I'm assuming what's happening here in many instances is that the sinking fund that's been built up to deal with cyclical repairs is used. That goes very quickly because of the scale of the costs. And then a situation where either the insurance costs have multiplied or they're not insured at all. Well, you know, this is an absurd state of affairs. This has to be a set of issues that the government addresses. Leaseholders should not be paying for a waking watch service where there is no evidence about its effectiveness. We've heard this week it's not evidence-based, and massive increases in insurance for something at the end of the day is not their fault. And we've had many instances of people making comparisons to other products that you buy as a consumer. How many times we see people refer to, you know, faulty cars that have had to be replaced at the manufacturer's expense, but here somehow the government seems to think it's acceptable that the victim and the consumer is the one that pays to put things right. It's wrong. It's profoundly wrong. I think it's been interesting that we've seen this gradual emergence of Conservative MPs, you know, being lobbied strongly by their constituents, some of whom would be seen as perhaps natural Conservative voters, as homeowners, and taking the view, no, we can't support this. And the fire safety bill, which has this amendment to rule out leaseholders being held responsible. I mean, obviously, this is before we get to the building safety bill, which will really bring in the onerous measures on leaseholders. But it's interesting how many Conservative MPs are now signing up saying it cannot be right that leaseholders are responsible for this. It'll be interesting to see where that goes. So, yeah, can I just say, I mean, I think that in terms of where we need to go on this. I think there's big question marks about the building safety bill and what that will mean in the future for leaseholders, because you're looking at a whole extra line in the service charges for costs associated with funding the new regime that has to be put in place. I understand that one manager will have maybe up to 20 blocks. So, you know, clearly there's going to be spreading of that cost. But when people are looking in future to sell their property, this will be something that a purchaser will be looking at. Well, what's in that line and how much is stacking up and what do we know about the works that will be required in the future? It comes back to the point that it's all very well saying you can take some buildings out of this, but it doesn't remove the risk. As it says in the revised guidance, it doesn't mean that, you know, there won't be a requirement for building safety works to be carried out in the future. It's just that it's deemed to be a lower risk. And in the case of my own building, I'm pretty confident that it'll be above the 25% cladding. We have a rendered external wall insulation system, to the best of my knowledge, that covers about 30%. So although we're 4 stories above ground, we've got a lower ground floor, we're 5 stories. Therefore, I think we will continue to be caught by this. I don't know whether the housing association, in this case Peabody, will meet the costs, or whether they will, once it comes to the point of having to do necessary work. Obviously, we're considered a low risk and way down the priorities. They're working on other blocks, high-rise blocks that have got, you know, very serious issues. But like everyone else in this situation, nobody can move. Remortgaging is a real problem, and we're stuck until a proper route is found out of this.
And then your EWS1 survey will take place, and then it's pretty much at the moment subjective as to whether you might fall into B1 or B2.
Yeah,
because it's based on opinion. You know, that's the.
Yes, I mean, we have it's only 20 flats. As I've mentioned, it's 4 stories above ground, 1 below ground. A properly functioning smoke and fire detector system. We had some extra fire safety works done when we had cyclical works carried out 2 years ago. Sort of improvements to the front doors, the letterboxes, some of those sort of routine things. Got a vented extract system that opens up window on the stairwell. Okay, and it's been tested in the sense that there was a near serious incident here just over a year ago where somebody had left a pan on the hob when they went out. It generated an enormous amount of smoke, filled up the corridors and stairwells. The alarm system went off. I found I had to run up and down the building to get people to leave, which was a little bit worrying. You know, there was not people necessarily realizing the seriousness, but we had 4 fire engines here within about, less than 5 minutes, coming from several fire stations.
The smoke vent system worked.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think one of the key things, and my observation of that would be that with all of the focus at the moment on cladding and external wall systems and things like that, that often we overlook the other fire and life safety systems within a building that are actually probably more serious or effective, that we need to make sure that they're being looked after, they're being maintained, that they're operable. We have this huge focus on external walls at the moment, and that is merely one component of this issue, and probably one that most people would be ignorant to if Grenfell had worked in a different way. If that fire had progressed in a different way, we probably wouldn't be looking at cladding right now. This would still be an unknown. So we do need to look at this in the round and say, ultimately, will this building perform as it should in the event of a fire?
Yeah, well, there were previous examples of how serious this problem was likely to be. The Larkhill one in particular, an insufficient response to that. You know, it was an indicator of the problems that were likely to be there. and as I was saying at the outset, I mean, one of my concerns is there's a real issue for us in quality of construction. So, you know, even with a set of improved standards that should be put in place, if you like, better regulation for the construction of buildings, I know from my own experience working with the construction industry over a long period of time, there are some fundamental issues in the approach taken. And I've had various examples of this. And I'll just give one that is an indicator that I was working for Lambeth Council in the 1980s. And in 1987, we had the hurricane. I'm sure even some of the younger people on here will remember that such a thing happened. We had various issues within the borough as a consequence of that hurricane. But one in particular was we had a pair of pretty well identical tower blocks on the Ashmole estate in Lambeth. And in the case of one of them, when somebody returned home during the very, very strong winds that opened their door, their window panel went, it shot out. And the whole block had to be evacuated, that people put in tenants or whatever. And in fact, both blocks had to then go through an inspection because, you know, clearly that should not have happened even in very strong winds. And we undertook what's called boroscopes that go down the cavity. Dare say something very similar is done in some of the examinations being carried out. Now, what we found in the case of the block where the window panel blew out is that most of the wall ties weren't there. And so they'd both been built, I think, at the end of the 1960s. When we did the boroscope on the other one, very good. Different contractor had built it, same specification. And there is a problem here with, you know, when things are hidden away in construction, it is so easy for this sort of thing to happen. You've got to have a rigorous inspection regime in place as a client. And certainly in subsequent years and schemes that I was responsible for me, it was really important to have a rigorous clerk of works approach. Doesn't necessarily mean you don't get some of this because things can still be hidden away, but holding contractors properly to account as the